Before we get into today's stories, visit dreadsarmy.com to sign up for the Dread Weekly newsletter so you don't miss out on any updates. Also, check out all of the channels in the Dread Network on dreadsarmy.com or in the description below. Thanks for listening. Now let's get to the stories. Hi, Donovan. I wanted to add my own story into the mix. In the last few years, it's becoming more acceptable to talk about UFOs and the possibility of life on other planets. And I thought my story would be a perfect fit. It actually starts at Christmas, although the event itself took place in August. My husband and I love getting out in nature, and my parents are aware of that. He's not great at giving gifts, but last Christmas he hit the nail on the head. He bought us 2 tickets to a remote astronomy show up in New Hampshire. We share a house in New Hampshire with my husband's family, so this couldn't have been more perfect. After doing the math, we figured out that the show itself was about a 45-minute drive from the house, so we decided to make it a long weekend. Thursday and Friday we just hung out, hit up some of our favorite local spots, and then Saturday night we got ready for the event. I'd never been to something like this before, but the directions were pretty clear. We were supposed to drive north to an area where they said the GPS would eventually cut out. There were directions on the packet we got with our tickets telling us how to get to a field. Once at the field, we'd park and set up to watch the show. They recommended bringing something to sit on, dinner, and drinks. Since it was August and the show was taking place at night, it was supposed to be pretty nice weather and clear skies. Once the GPS cut off, I read the directions to my husband, and we found ourselves on some pretty serious back roads. All dirt or gravel, really narrow, lots of potholes. It was rough going, and for some sections we weren't hitting more than 10 miles per hour. This was truly out in the middle of nowhere. Eventually, we turned off of the road and onto a field and followed a line of cars. After parking, we followed everyone up a big hill where a guy with a megaphone was directing the crowd to find seating. It was still light out and he had live music. There must have been at least 150 other people there. We found a spot, set up beach chairs, and had a beer and some takeout we'd grabbed on the way there. The actual show itself was presented by a guy named Mark. He was a trained astronomer as well as a hobbyist and had apparently been doing this for the last 3 decades. Mark was making the rounds, and we overheard him telling one group that it would be an exciting night, as we should be able to see one of the space stations. My husband and I were pretty excited at this point and couldn't wait for dark. Eventually, it was dark enough and headlights had been off long enough that Mark decided to get started. He used a microphone to introduce himself, explain what he'd be going over tonight, and show us how his laser pointer worked. He started off with a few of the more well-known stars in a planet that was super visible. My husband and I were excited and tucked right in. Since we were in the middle of nowhere, it was literally pitch black except for the laser pointer. Honestly, kind of scary. Even on top of a hill, the nearest lights we could see were just before the horizon. Mark was really engaging and kept pointing out shooting stars, which he explained scientifically. Eventually, part of the crowd near the back started murmuring and making a bit of noise. This had happened a few times with people who had questions for Mark. Eventually, they would just call them out. But the noise came and went. People would murmur, shift around, and then it would quiet down. A few seconds later, it'd start again, a little bit louder. Mark asked everyone to please keep it down, and someone shouted out that they had seen the space station. We were about 15 feet away from Mark and could see that he was visibly confused, especially when the person, a woman who ended up standing up, pointed in the direction that she and others had seen the station. Mark insisted that the space station would not be coming from that direction, so she must have seen a shooting star. Especially there wasn't anything visible in the sky at the moment. But as he was speaking, we were all turned in that direction looking, and we saw it. Or rather, I should say, them. 3 very bright lights that were definitely too big to be stars or planets hovered low in the sky. They were all identical too, a bright bluish white and slightly elongated. I thought they all seemed to be strung together in a straight line. Mark went dead quiet, and the people at the back of the crowd started talking excitedly again. My husband and I actually turned our chair around to get a better look. At this point, a lot of people were taking their phones out and snapping photos. Mark and his assistant were talking when suddenly one of the lights shot straight up and disappeared completely. That left two lights both sitting in the exact same spot, unmoving. Everyone was speechless for a second, and then erupted in loud conversation and some shouts. Mark tried to calm everyone down, but he was also looking on his phone, probably to see if there were any reported objects in this area of the sky. As we watched, a second light shot off toward the west. It moved slowly at first and then faster until it too disappeared without a trace. I'm not talking that it moved so far away that it went out of sight. It just suddenly wasn't there. So then only the last light remained. It was hovering for almost 2 minutes before it dipped down a little lower in the sky. It moved slowly east and it was clear enough for us all to watch it. My husband was taking a video on his phone. Then, like the other two lights, this one shot off and disappeared as well. We were all left talking about what it could have been. Mark, who was obviously out of sorts, tried to get everyone to calm down, but the rest of his show had a very restless feeling. Once the show was over, the drive back was actually a little eerie as my husband and I discussed what we might have seen. There were no lights at all in this part of New Hampshire, only our headlights, and we were keeping a close eye out for deer, but I couldn't help looking up at the sky occasionally too. We got back to the house a little after midnight and stayed talking about the lights. The only explanation we could come up with, since Mark had insisted he didn't know what they were, was UFOs. There were enough people at the show that for a few days various videos and photos were circling around on social media. My husband and I showed our friends since we were pretty excited about what we'd seen. I was a little bummed to miss out on the space station, but we probably saw something that not many people see in their lifetimes, so it was an easy trade-off. Now we're thinking of going back for a show next year too. In the end, it was definitely the best Christmas present ever. Hey Donovan, Jim here. Just your everyday fish catching guy from good old Milford, Connecticut. Fishing's been my bread and butter as long as I can remember. But man, something happened recently that's been messing with my head. I gotta tell you about it. Here we have this old rundown pier on the outskirts of town, the one that's always teeming with fish. It's actually a fishing mecca. Well, I was there a few evenings ago. Just me, my fishing gear, and my trusty thermos of coffee, all set for a quiet evening. But boy, was I in for a surprise. That peaceful pier that I've been to a million times turned out to be the set for a real-life horror show. Before the freaky encounter, I noticed a few off things. The sea was unusually calm, and the usual seagull chatter and other sea noises were missing. There was also this awful smell, like rotting seaweed but much stronger. Now, when I think about it, all these things were like warning signs of the bizarre spectacle that was about to take place. Now get ready for the wild part. As I'm sitting there relaxing, I start to notice something. There, emerging from the depths of the water, an enormous beast standing about 8 feet tall rises. This creature, it's right there on the pier, completely out of the water, standing upright like some kind of twisted mockery of a man. Can you imagine the sight of that? It's like something straight out of a creature feature, a true horror show in flesh and bone. But its face, it's not something you would forget. Picture an alligator. You've seen them at the zoo or on TV, right? All scaly skin, elongated snout filled with sharp, jagged teeth. Now imagine that on a creature standing tall on 2 legs. It's surreal and incredibly frightening. Something you'd think was possible only in nightmares or fantasy tales. And its eyes. Oh boy, those eyes. They were this disturbing shade of yellow, like aged, stained parchment or the eerie glow of a jack-o'-lantern on Halloween night. And the way they glowed, it was as if there was some wicked, evil intelligence lurking behind them. You could almost feel them boring into you, like the creature was studying you, sizing you up. It sent shivers down my spine. The creature's movements were just as odd. It was like watching a toddler take its first steps, or an old man with knees that have seen better days. Each step seemed labored, painstaking, as if the creature was at odds with gravity itself. It was a strange, awkward dance between the creature and the firm ground beneath it, a dance that was as fascinating as it was terrifying. I know it's hard to picture, but think of the scariest scene from a horror movie you've seen. Imagine that scene unfolding right in front of you, in your real world, not on some distant, safe movie screen. The terror, the creeping dread, it's so real you could practically taste it. Terrifying doesn't even begin to describe it. It's a whole new level of fear. Yet, the most bizarre part? I couldn't tear my eyes away from it. Like a moth drawn to a flame despite every instinct screaming at me to run and to hide, my gaze was locked onto the creature. There was an eerie silence, an unsettling calmness that fell over the scene. The only sounds piercing the silence were the creature's heavy breaths. Each exhale, a low growl that echoed in the still night air, and its awkward shuffling against the rough wood of the pier. The creaking of the timbers under its weight was like the desperate groan of the pier itself, echoing my own silent cries of fear. The moonlight cast an unearthly glow on the creature, highlighting the grotesque scales that covered its body. They glistened, almost metallic, like tiny shields offering protection to this beast from the depths. Its long arms ended in claws that scraped against the pier, a grating sound that sent chills up my spine. As it moved closer, I could see the steam rising from its body, a strange fog that swirled around it. Perhaps it was the cold seawater evaporating from its heated body, or maybe it was another of its bizarre alien qualities. It added an additional layer of horror to the scene, as if it was a phantom emerging from some ethereal plane. It was like I was hypnotized by the terrible spectacle before me, held captive by my own fear and fascination. As the creature continued its laborious, painful walk on the pier, I felt a shudder run through me. Eventually, my mind clicked in and I was out of there as soon as I could move, questioning whether I'd lost my mind. Even now, the image of that creature and its menacing yellow eyes haunts me. It's made the thought of going back to the sea really tough. Sure, the encounter was brief, but its effects, man, they've stuck around. It's gotten to the point where I'm too scared to return to my favorite fishing spot. I was shaking as I started my truck and drove away from the pier that day, my heart pounding in my chest. That monstrous figure still lurks in my mind, making my days gloomy and my dreams nightmarish. Even the sea, which used to feel like home, now seems like a place of terror. Every unexpected wave or sound has me on edge. I can't shake this feeling of dread, this constant reminder of the horror hidden beneath the sea's calm surface. Anyway, that's what's been going on with me, Donovan. A few years ago now, I was driving home through a really thick wooded backcountry road. I was heading to the old farmhouse that my parents had lived in forever. It was fall, but not too late in the evening. The sun was still in the sky, although getting close to setting. If I think about it, I remember it was around September or October. I want to say the sun set somewhere between 7 and 8 that night. I can't be exactly sure, but it was probably sometime around there. I had the radio cranked so I couldn't hear much, but it wasn't like I was on the highway. Chances were I wouldn't encounter another vehicle until I pulled up to the house. That's just how remote and isolated my parents were, and they preferred it that way. They enjoyed the absolute solitude and silence of not having any neighbors nearby. In this day and age, I can't really blame them. I did, however, have my wits about me and my eyes on the road. No distractions for me. That is because, firstly, I'm not a moron, and also a buddy of mine had wiped out and hit a buck a few months back. He completely totaled his car. I think he was doing 60 or 70. And of course, I think it was a 4-6 pointer that walked out in front of his car. And he wasn't driving anything too impressive. I think it was a Toyota Camry. So you can imagine the carnage that happened. Luckily, by the blessing of whatever higher power you believe in, he managed to only have a couple fractures here and there. Nothing too big, but I really didn't want to be dealing with that. Mostly for me, I especially didn't want the fallout of not having a vehicle to work with. So while singing along to the radio, but paying attention to the road, I was able to throw my foot down hard on the brake as soon as I saw what I thought was a large deer. It had run out in front of me. My Aunt Susie used to be obsessed with a TV show called The X-Files. I've watched a few reruns with her and it's been on cable TV. If you're the right age, I'm sure you've heard of it. But if you haven't, well, just Google it. This thing that stood in front of my car, my first thought was, thanks to Mulder, that it was a werewolf. Thankfully, I had the good sense to remember that they only come out at night and on a full moon. I'll have you know, I did my lore research. I was able to take a closer look at this mysterious creature. It stood still, as if it was caught in a moment of indecision, unsure whether it should run or stay. This gave me ample time to check it out. This creature was gigantic, and its body was covered entirely in hair or fur, which made me think it resembled something like a Bigfoot. Could it have been a Bigfoot, you ask? Maybe, but it had a unique feature. Its head was that of a dog. The creature's face also wasn't what you'd expect from a traditional Bigfoot. Instead, it had characteristics that were more wolf-like, as if it was a human with certain wolfish traits. But it wasn't a typical human face. It had parts that looked distinctly wolfish, like it had a snout. Also, it had ears that were definitely wolf-like. These ears were tall, pointed, and even had tufts of hair at their tips, like those of a wolf. What was it exactly? Honestly, I don't know. If I had to compare it to anything, I'd say it most closely resembled a human-sized German Shepherd. You see, we have a German Shepherd at my parents' farm, so try to visualize this. Imagine a German Shepherd's face, painted it all in black, and the top portion of its face, the part where there's no snout, looking somewhat human. That's what I saw in this creature. Whatever this thing was, I was sure and certain that this didn't normally exist, whatever it was, but fortunately, it didn't seem to want to hurt me. I kind of got the impression by the whole encounter that this thing was caught off guard by my car, almost running into it, and it seemed like it had to make a quick decision to bolt across the road to get out of there. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my racing heart, and tried to comprehend what I was seeing. Was it a hallucination? Or some kind of strange animal, yet to be discovered by science? I didn't know, but one thing was certain: I didn't want to stick around to find out. With one last glance at the creature, I pushed the pedal to the metal and the car lurched forward, tires screeching against the asphalt. As I glanced in my rearview mirror, I could see the creature still standing there, watching me drive away. Its yellow eyes were almost glowing in the dark, reflecting the last bit of light from my taillights. Even after I got home, the image of the creature lingered in my mind. Sleep didn't come easily that night, and when it did, my dreams were filled with images of that creature. I knew I had to find out what it was, or at least try. I decided to research cryptids and unexplained creatures to see if I could find any information about what I had seen. But no matter how much I searched, I couldn't find any creature that resembled what I saw that night. Even to this day, the memory of that night still haunts me. It's become a story I tell around the campfire, a tale of a mysterious creature in the night. What it was, I might never know, but one thing's for sure: it was an experience I'll never forget. This happened in Northwest Utah. I was sent out by dispatch to investigate an incident with a wild animal at an old farmhouse. Not really my area, but we didn't have a local animal control in the county, so the job fell to me. The call came in the night before, but since it wasn't technically an emergency and no one was in danger, the station waited until the morning to send someone out. I reached the farmhouse at about 8:15 a.m. The woman who lived there was elderly, I'd say, in her 70s if I had to guess. I don't recall her exact age. She lived alone in the house, and the farm was no longer in use. The woman kept a few goats as pets, but that was about it. There were 3 buildings on the property besides the house. A large barn that sat directly opposite the house, a smaller barn next to it, and a small storage area that was situated perpendicular to the smaller barn. The goats were kept in the smaller barn. The other buildings were used for storage. The story she told me when I arrived was absolutely bizarre. She said the incident happened at around 9 or 10 p.m. the night before, but she had been having problems before that for quite a while. She claimed her goats had been disappearing out of the pen at night. She couldn't figure it out. She had installed chicken wire on the inside of the fence to prevent any animals from getting under the boards. But the goats kept disappearing. It wouldn't be often. Maybe a couple of goats would go missing every month. There was no pattern to it and no signs of animals breaking in through the fence. She figured someone must have been stealing them, so she started putting them all inside the barn at night and locking the doors with chains and a padlock. When she began keeping the goats inside, they stopped disappearing. But other, stranger things began happening. She would hear knocking on the walls of her house and on the roof. Like someone was trying to beat the walls down, but whenever she would go to investigate, the noises stopped. She said sometimes she would hear a screeching or screaming sound coming from outside, but never found its source. Last night, she heard the screeching sound again and went out onto the porch to investigate. She looked around but didn't see anything at first, but then a pair of eyes caught her attention. The woman said there was a giant bird-looking creature sitting atop the roof of the larger barn. She claimed it had to be about 5 to 6 feet tall and had a crest on its head and a very long, narrow beak. She said she knew that was the creature responsible for killing her goats. Its eyes reflected back at her and then it took flight. She said its wings were more like a bat than a bird. It had feathers, but it looked to have claws like a bat does. She said the creature flew straight towards her and she ran back inside the house and locked the door. She said she had never seen a bird like that in all her years of living out there. The creature rammed its body into the closed door. The woman said she was terribly frightened, but she wanted to know what it was, so she looked through the window next to the door. She said it looked reptilian, like a sort of flying lizard. It had feathers, but the eyes of a snake. I wasn't really sure what to do about this situation. This woman just described a dinosaur to me. I figured it was just a very large predatory bird, and maybe the woman's eyes weren't what they used to be. I recorded her story just as she told it. I did add a note that I thought it was likely a large vulture. She showed me the scratches on the door and the outside of the house, and there was substantial damage. I didn't have a good explanation for her, nor did I have a solution. She showed me the barn where the creature tried to break in. I asked if she had a gun because she is allowed to shoot any animal on her property that is threatening her livestock, whatever type of animal it turns out to be. I told her it might be a good idea to set up cameras to try to figure out what type of bird it was and go from there. What she really wanted was for someone to just get rid of the creature for her, but there wasn't much I could do about that. I did investigate the area around the goat pasture and the barn. If I hadn't gone out there, I would have written this incident off on the ramblings of a crazy old lady. I found a feather. Just one. It was huge, like it belonged to an eagle or possibly something larger. The feather itself was red with bits of yellow splattered in towards the stem. I bagged it for evidence. I told the woman I would send it out for testing and see what species it is. And that was that, or so I thought. I sent the feather out to be tested. It's not typically something we would do, but I was curious. It had been a month and I hadn't heard anything about the feather. I asked my superior and he told me the test came back as inconclusive. I did a bit of digging and called the lab myself. Now here is where it gets weird. When I asked about the results of the feather and gave them the case number, they told me it was classified and I didn't have clearance to get the results. The old woman called me at the station a few days later. She said a team of detectives had been out to her farm to follow up on the case, but they wouldn't give her any information. I didn't have anything else to tell her other than I believed her and to get something to protect herself and her goats if she planned on staying out there. I can't tell you what the creature was, but I do know there was a significant effort to cover it up. About 2 months ago, my roommate and I moved into an apartment in an old mill town. With the housing market so crazy, we ended up deciding not to buy a house like we'd planned. Apartment prices have also been really high, but we got lucky and this building had someone break their lease unexpectedly. The apartments are in an old paper mill and ours is on the second floor facing a pond. The pond we can see is called Paper Goods. It's not huge, but it has a nice little public frontage area where people can park, eat lunch, and walk their dogs. It gets a lot of foot traffic. We have a smaller dog who is older now, and it's convenient that the park is there because he has to go out like every 2 hours. I've been working from home ever since the pandemic, which works out perfectly. My roommate Jason is a nurse at the local hospital and usually works the third shift. He gets home around 7 a.m. every morning. My job starts around 8, so I wake up early and have a few hours to eat, clean up, and take the dog out before Jason gets home to sleep. A week after moving into the apartment, I took our dog Sam outside really early. He wakes me up when he needs to go out, and I get up really quickly so that he doesn't have an accident. I went out in sweatpants and a jacket since it was starting to get cold here. Dawn was just coming up and it wasn't quite light out. The street lights were still on and the pond's covered in mist. It was really pretty, and I snapped a picture to send Jason while Sam was sniffing around. I crossed the street to go over into the little park and kept an eye out for the geese, who usually hang out looking for bread and scraps. A little past the picnic tables, there's an area with stairs that leads down to the water. You can't actually get to the water because of the reeds, and it's always shady there. I was waiting for Sam to finish checking out a rock when I looked up and saw a person standing near the reeds. But after a few seconds, I realized it wasn't a person, just a person-shaped figure in the mist. I moved a little closer and noticed that where the feet should have been, there was nothing. The figure was floating about a foot off the gravel. Sam didn't seem concerned at all and kept wandering down the path, which circled much closer to the figure. I went along but kept my keys in between my fingers just in case. We got about 15 feet away and the figure shifted a little in the opposite direction. It was like a denser gathering of fog in a vaguely human shape. Again, Sam didn't react to it at all and just kept going. As we headed back toward the apartment building, I kept turning to look back, but it didn't move from that spot. By the time we got back inside, when I looked out the window, the fog was mostly gone over the pond, and the figure was as well. I didn't tell Jason about it because I knew it sounded crazy. I didn't see it the next day anyway. There wasn't any fog. But 2 days later, it was there again in almost the same spot. This time, I crept a little bit closer, and again the figure moved away from me, only a few feet, but it was definitely reacting to me moving closer. Jason had the next day off, so I decided not to say anything again, knowing he'd be the one to bring Sam out first thing. He commented that I was up really early. I usually sleep in when he's off, and I just waved it off. But I watched at the window when he took Sam over to the pond. I had to squint, but even from our apartment, I could see the shape in the fog, in almost the same spot, near the reeds. I also saw the exact moment he saw it. Jason stopped for a second, but Sam kept trying to trot ahead and got snagged. After a few seconds, Jason actually turned around and headed back to the apartment. I was waiting at the door when he got there and asked if he'd seen it. He immediately asked me what it was, not even bothering to ask how I knew about it. I told him I had no idea, and we stood in the kitchen talking about it. Like I said, it was early enough in the day that we never saw anyone else over there, so we didn't know if anyone else had seen it. I explained I'd seen it a few days ago, but wanted to see if he noticed it too, so I'd know I wasn't crazy. We both agreed that whatever it was, whether it was a natural phenomenon or some kind of ghost, didn't seem malevolent in any way. It just kind of hung out there. We kept seeing it over the next few days. When Jason got home in the morning, he'd ask if I'd seen it and I'd update him. On days he was off, we woke up together and took Sam out to get another look at it. We never saw any features, heard any voices or anything like that. But every now and then we'd see what looked like an arm or a leg, and the figure would look a little more like a person. These last few days we haven't seen the figure at all, since there hasn't been any fog or mist. Part of me thinks maybe it's hanging around in the same spot anyway, but I'm too scared to walk over and try to feel it out. We're going to continue keeping an eye out for it, and hopefully it keeps showing up, whatever it is.